To a human being wandering on a beach, the sea is a constant source of small marvels. To a crab, on the other hand, it's a source of food. In Bermuda, skeletons of strange animals litter the sand. These tiny egg-shaped things are less than a centimeter across. They must have come from the open sea, but although it's part of our planet, their home is scarcely better known to mankind than the surface of the moon. This is one of the largest habitats on Earth, and one of the least known, the thin layer on the surface of the open ocean. The water here can be as much as 4 miles deep. At the bottom, it's dark and virtually lifeless. Above, there's just empty sky. The passers-by are characters from travelers' tales, like giant jellyfish. But there are others, too, residents, a rich and complex community whose way of life few people have ever seen. Here's one of them, the Portuguese man-of-war. It's usually seen only at the end of its life, when it gets washed up on shore. Then people fear it because of its agonizing sting. Those trailing tentacles can extend to as much as 150 feet, armed from end to end with stinging cells. The tentacles are the man-of-war's lifeline. As defensive weapons, they're of limited use, but they're very effective fish traps. The knobby brown spirals, like coiled strings of beads, are made up of clusters of stinging cells. Each tentacle is, in fact, a separate animal, specialized for the job of killing prey. The man-of-war is an alien life form to us land dwellers, a complex organism which is, in fact, an animal colony. The float was the original man-of-war, the vessel on which others sail. The members of the colony hanging below it started life as buds, growing from the parent animal. As well as stinging animals, the colony contains stomach animals, whose sole job is to digest food for the good of the community. Straight strings of pale beads are touch detectors to alert the stingers when prey is near. That branching mass, like a bunch of pink mistletoe, contains the reproductive members. The surface of each stinging cluster is covered with tiny trapdoors. Each one conceals a single coiled sting, which can be shot out in a moment. The stings are barely half a millimeter long, hollow tubes filled with paralyzing venom. When they penetrate a fish or a person, a bulb at the end pumps poison into the victim. When the man-of-war goes fishing, other members of the colony have a part to play. As the fish struggles, the tentacle animals contract, dragging it nearer the surface, where the stomach animals can reach it. They can manage to engulf quite large prey at times, as big as a sardine. Yet when they're closed, their mouths are only 2 millimeters across. The digestive fluids reduce each fish to a bag of liquid nourishment. The other animals in the colony get their share as the fats and proteins diffuse through the community. Not all fish are vulnerable to the man-o'-war's venom. Clownfish swim unharmed among the tentacles, protected from their enemies by the stings. The clownfish seems to be protected from its protector by a coat of mucus. Evidently, it sometimes takes advantage of the man-o'-war. Scientists have found bits of tentacle in the clownfish's stomachs. No one suggests that clownfish actively feed on men-o'-war, but some other creatures do. A strange and wonderful inhabitant of the ocean surface far from land is a floating predatory sea slug called glaucus. Glaucus lives upside down. It's buoyed up against the water surface by a bubble of air in its stomach. It eats the stinging animals of the man-o'-war. It eats stomach animals and touch animals as well, but the stinging animals are the most important. Glaucus can take the sting cells into its stomach without firing them off. No one knows how. Each of those finger-like tentacles is hollow. Inside is a lobe of the stomach, and from a tiny pore at the end, glaucus can actually squirt those still loaded sting cells at any attacker. This is not an attack. It's the courtship of a pair of open ocean wanderers, slugs that pass in the night. Wrote in The Ancient Mariner, "Slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea." You can't help thinking he was referring to glaucus. After mating, glaucus produces a string of tiny eggs from an opening in its side. They drift off, the beginning of a new generation. Glaucus might be called unearthly, but here's another drifter which is heavenly, like a stained glass window. It's another of the jellyfish family called Porpita. Porpita has a horny float which supports a group of branching tentacles, each with a clump of sting cells at the tip. They can be spread out in the hope of catching some tiny prey animal. But glaucus is neither tiny nor prey. To the jellyfish, it's bad news. Even baby glaucuses, about half a centimeter long, have a voracious appetite for small porpitas. Each glaucus has to bump into several porpoises or at least one man-o-war every day to get enough to eat. This gives you an idea of just how frequently these blue water animals must meet. There's a snail which lives upside down like glaucus. It's called Yanthina, and it stays afloat by hanging from a raft of bubbles which it makes itself from quick-setting mucus. It feeds on stinging animals too. Glaucus itself is not a stinging animal, although it has that armament of stinging cells stolen from the man-o-war. But they're no protection against Yanthina. The snail's mouth is armed with rows of thorns, just the thing for dragging in and ripping off the tentacles of a slippery creature like glaucus. When the last of the tentacles is safely tucked away, Yanthina drifts on in search of its next victim. It has no control over its destination or its diet. Like the other blue water drifters, it's at the mercy of winds and surface currents. To survive, it has to be prepared to eat any living thing it meets. The open sea has many moods. Sometimes it's gray and depressing. At other times, it's like liquid sapphire. But the predominant color of all the drifters we've seen so far has been blue. There is another group of drifters, just as numerous in the open ocean, but predominantly brown. Many of them are passengers. They can't float unaided. Instead, they ride passively on floating objects. Goose barnacles are inveterate hitchhikers. They live by straining tiny animals out of the water, using their bristly legs as filters. All organic fragments of the right size are potential food for the barnacles, including a tiny porpoita at the mercy of the currents. In one part of the North Atlantic, there's a plant which provides a floating home for hundreds of different forms of life. It's the seaweed called sargassum. Sargassum lives its entire life adrift, far from land. The currents and the wind gather it together in the middle of the North Atlantic basin, to one side of the huge clockwise circulation called the North Atlantic Gyre. The Sargasso Sea, as it's called, was dreaded by early sailors as a place of endless calm, a dead patch to be avoided on the way to America. But it was sargassum which led to the discovery of America, or so one version of the story goes. When Columbus's crew was near mutiny, sick with scurvy and scared of the unknown, they decided not to turn back after all when their ship sailed into this expanse of weed. A piece dragged up over the side proved to have crabs in it, a sure sign, or so the sailors thought, that land was near at last. But land was still hundreds of miles away. Many of the animals which live on the Sargassum weed are like those which usually inhabit coastal waters. But these hardly ever see the shore, just drifting clumps of weed in mid-ocean. This may well have been Columbus's crab. It's a swimming crab, but the farthest it ever swims is to the next clump of weeds. Other animals living in the weed are also typical of shallow water. A pipefish and a small prawn look more like rock pool dwellers than mid-ocean rovers. The fish which live near the weed rafts are there for the shelter and for the chance of finding food. Small squid, too, shelter among the Sargassum. The open oceans are full of fast-swimming predators, so for the surface drifters, any shelter is welcome. A crab changing clumps in mid-ocean is desperately vulnerable. At least the fish, the squid, and the crab can swim. There are other animals living out here in the Sargassum which are completely dependent on the buoyancy of the weed. Tiny Sargassum barnacles live side by side with baby goose barnacles, sitting on a relative shell. A minute bristleworm lives there too, sharing their food. The man-o-war colony was made up of cooperative animals of the same species, but the Sargassum community contains competitive animals of many different species. One of the Sargassum animals, Membranipara, builds colonies which encrust the stems and bladders of the plant. Like its common neighbor, Senkarini, it's fixed to the spot as firmly as plants on land. Senkarini is a relative of the man-o-war, but a much simpler type of animal. Its stubby tentacles have only a few stinging cells, and it stands stiffly in the water, drawn up to its full height of 1 millimeter or so, in the hope that something edible will bump into it. Membranipara feeds in a different way. It's one of a group called moss animals. The members of the colony reach out from inside a hard skeleton to grope about like minute barnacles. But their tentacles are covered in cilia, like tiny beating hairs, which create currents to waft food particles down to the animal's mouth. Membranipara's food is specks of organic matter adrift in the water. Larger animals need larger prey, like this towering anemone, nearly a full centimeter high. Like the man-o-war, it stings its prey with a similar type of stinging cell. The prey the anemone is catching gives us the answer to an obvious question. What do so many drifting carnivores find to eat? The answer is copepods, tiny things like shrimp, which live in the upper layers of the sea in countless millions. To the anemone, a single copepod is a tiny snack, but to the Syncarini jellyfish, it's a large, nourishing meal to be subdued, engulfed, and digested at leisure. The filaments from the stinging cells are barbed, so the copepod cannot break free. The venom eventually puts an end to its struggles. Membranipara picks up any tiny residual fragments discarded during the struggle. The importance of copepods is that most of them are herbivores, feeding on tiny plants. Since plants use sunlight as their energy source, copepods are therefore the community's vital link with that energy. Without them, the mid-ocean food web could not exist. A tiny fish in the remorseless grip of a Sargassum anemone, another part of the web. It probably fed on copepods before getting eaten by the anemone. The anemone, in turn, attracts a small slug called spirilla, which climbs about among the weed stems. The curly brown structures on its back are a combination of gills and stomach. Expect that among all this desperate eating of each other, the Sargassum community would contain some large herbivores to eat the weed itself. But then survivors of a shipwreck miles from land would hardly eat the raft that keeps them afloat. They're much more likely to turn hungry eyes on each other. Another little crab which lives on the floating clumps is called Planes, the wanderer. They come in different colors. Dark ones live in the center of the clump, and light ones on the edges. But the master of camouflage is the anglerfish. Its main food is another permanent inhabitant of the Sargassum, the little prawn called Latreutes. The camouflage of the fish is so good that it takes a while to see it at all. The anglerfish is ideally equipped for moving about in the dense clumps of weed. Its fins are modified until they're almost like feet, and its gill openings are concealed behind the front pair. Hiding its gill movements helps the angler's camouflage. The anglerfish eats prawns, not Sargassum bladders. The angler is camouflaged to help it stalk its prey, but presumably also to help it avoid being eaten, although what eats it, nobody yet knows. Inside the weed clumps, it's safe, both from predators and from the danger of drifting away. Young anglerfish spend the first part of their lives much deeper down, as much as 300 feet below the surface. When they've grown to a centimeter long, they come up to join the adults. Not always the safest move. The angler is tied to the Sargassum by considerations of safety and food. It never ventures into the open water, unless disaster overtakes the weed. Another species of fish lives here, a little flying fish. It's much more of a traveler as an adult, but it too is tied to the weed, literally, for the first part of its life. A flying fish nest is a mass of threads produced by the adult, like a giant cocoon, with the developing eggs safely tied up inside. The whole structure is about the size of a football and just about as strongly made. The tiny larvae inside the eggs are as safe as if they were in houses. Since nothing feeds on the sargassum, there's no danger of their nest being eaten around them. Soon after they hatch, they slip through the tangled strands into the open sea. Unlike the adults, the baby flying fish have no ready means of escape from the numerous predators of the ocean surface. But for all the dangers of stinging tentacles and hungry mouths, the ocean surface is the great gathering place for the dispersive phase in all these animals' lives, when the various species spread to new clumps of weed or new areas of ocean. Sometimes the young ones disperse, like the flying fish. Sometimes there are two completely different forms of the animal, one which swims free and one which is fixed in position. The form of the jellyfish Syncorini, which lives on the sargassum, is the sedentary form of the animal. When it reaches a certain size, lumps begin to grow along its stem. They're the buds of a new generation. They'll develop into tiny mobile adults called medusae, which will go out into the world to breed. When the buds are ripe, they begin to move. They have enemies at this stage. A race develops between roving predators like flatworms and the medusae struggling to break free. Each tiny medusa is equipped with a few tentacles for feeding, a swimming bell to drive it through the water, and most important, maturing sexual organs which will produce the seeds of the next generation. From beneath the dense, heaving mat of sargassum, tiny animals are spreading out into the ocean to join the teeming microscopic world of the plankton, perhaps the most numerous and varied community on Earth. This is its stronghold, in the upper layers of the open sea. To see the plankton animals at all, you first have to collect them. The best way is to tow a fine mesh net slowly through the water for an hour or so. The net has 3 meshes to the millimeter. that's just fine enough to catch the shrimp-like copepods. The plankton is populated by plenty of other animals. On a microscopic scale, it's as varied and as violent as the South American jungle or the African bush. It can be as beautiful, too. This is a plant called basilaria, or the sliding diatom. It drifts about the ocean among constellations of the eggs, larvae, and adults of innumerable species of animals. The plankton is crowded with the dispersive phases of crabs, snails, jellyfish, starfish, like a soup of animal seeds that washes the coasts of the world. Some of them are hungry predators. Others, like the copepods, are everybody else's prey. Some live out their whole lives in the open ocean, but many of the planktonic animals are on their way to somewhere else, a new clump of sargassum, or a new shore far from the place where they started life. Most marine mollusks produce larvae which drift about in the open sea until they find a suitable place to grow up. They bear little resemblance to their parents. They're specialized for a completely different way of life. The plankton is full of things which look, frankly, like nothing on Earth. A sand mason worm starts life as a planktonic larva inside a tube of jelly. It feeds by trapping tiny particles of organic matter on its sticky tentacles. When it grows up, it will burrow in the sand of some distant beach. This glorious sunburst lives in the open ocean all its life. It's a foraminiferan, a very ancient type of animal. The skeletons of its direct ancestors have formed the mud of the seafloor for hundreds of millions of years. In the center of the sunburst, there's a cloud of protoplasm, ready to creep out and engulf anything trapped on the spines. Almost inevitably, its main prey is copepods, though it catches crab larvae as well and other small swimmers. Plankton contains the free-swimming medusae of sedentary animals, minute jellyfish which spread the species to new clumps of weed. At certain times of the year, the plankton becomes crowded with the larvae of another group of sedentary animals, corals. They swim slowly about, propelled by tiny beating hairs. The chances are very slim of any of these planktonic larvae actually arriving anywhere useful before they die or get eaten. To perpetuate their species, they must be produced in astronomical numbers. Coral larvae sometimes turn the sea pink as millions of them surface at once. The larvae enter the plankton in shallow water. Coral grows mostly around coasts. Other planktonic larvae come from the land itself to be spread across the ocean to colonize new shores. These are the tiny larvae of a land crab. They hatch from a mass of eggs deposited in the sea by the females in a strange ritual which takes place for only a few days, just once a year. There are thousands of them in each mass of eggs. Very few will ever grow up. To see where they come from, we must go ashore. The beaches of warm oceans are dominated by a very successful scavenger called the ghost crab. It lives in burrows below the high water mark. Ghost crabs are only one part of the story. In Bermuda, as on most islands and warm seas, the land crabs live on the dry ground behind the beach. They make burrows in the woods and feed on green shoots, grass, and fallen fruits. They keep off the open beach as a rule, but once a year, their burrows begin to appear among the vegetation on the beach crest. The males lead the way, gradually establishing a bridgehead in the ghost crab's part of the beach. As the numbers of red land crabs increase, the males begin to compete for space. Newcomers have to find somewhere to dig without trespassing on a neighbor's territory. Eventually, the land crab line extends right across the beach at high tide level about 2 days after the invasion began. By now, the land crabs are getting very close, and the ghost crabs begin to take an interest in them. Ghost crabs are by nature inquisitive. Like all scavengers, they get their living from being observant and exploratory. They tend to hang around the land crab burrows as if they were watching what's going on. The ghost crabs have to maintain their own burrows as well. They're filled in with sand and debris every time the tide comes in. The land crab holes are drier and more permanent. Then, one night at full moon, when the tides are highest, the females start to move down out of the woods. They come in hundreds and thousands, rustling over the leaf litter, heading for the beach. Exactly what happens next is not clear. Some people say that the females mate with the males in the burrows on the beach crest. If they do, the eggs must develop incredibly quickly. The male's bridgehead might, on the other hand, be just what it seems, clearing a way to the sea for the females who have mated already. Land crabs have no tolerance for salt water, so they don't stay long in the sea. Once they feel the water around them, they lower their abdomens and shake off the eggs. The eggs hatch at once. Thousands of tiny larvae swim off into the sea to be carried out by the falling tide into the great universal plankton soup. One of their enemies is an extraordinary beast called Copilia, which has a more advanced optical system than anything else its size. No one knows quite how its eyes work, but they have such perfect lenses and such a complex system of fiber optic tubes to lead the light back into its body that Copilia can probably see exceptionally well. The light-sensitive part of the tube is at the back, in the form of a curved, dark brown pigmented area. Copilia cruises in the surface layers of the sea. It's a couple of millimeters long, a tiny predator on the lookout for even tinier prey. Other planktonic animals, such as crab and lobster larvae, have more orthodox, compound eyes. Some species of fish produce eggs which float into plankton. Each one is held in the correct position for development by a small oil droplet, which acts as a float. The fish fry are no bigger than the head of a pin, but they are already beginning to move. The sea off Bermuda is the starting point of a long journey for the land crab larvae. At the same time, it's the journey's end for some of the drifters. Bermuda is included in the circulation pattern of the North Atlantic currents when they shift about 10 degrees to the north each summer. The land crabs have retreated, though not without leaving casualties. Shorebirds, particularly turnstone and sanderling, find their living at the edge of the tide, as they do the world over. Soon, exotic flotsam begins to appear on the beach, delicate corpses of animals from the far deep. Sometimes the animal is intact. Glaucus still has its defensive armament in working order, though its painful sting won't save it now. Summer storms, together with the northerly shift of the trade winds, bring shoals of deep water drifters onto Bermuda's coastline. A third type of crab, a rock climbing specialist, is also waiting for them. It's Grapsus, otherwise known as Sally Lightfoot. Sally Lightfoot is very good at hanging on to the rocks right at the water's edge. It's usually the first to lay claws on the arriving men of war. Stranded float animals seem to be writhing in agony. Their movements are triggered by the wind as it dries their outer membrane. At sea, movements would cause the float to capsize, wetting the dry membrane. But here on land, they're useless. Sting cells stay active long after the tentacles have dried out, as many a fisherman has learned painfully. You can be badly stung by a dry tentacle stuck to a net, for example. The crabs are immune to the poison. They seem to find the tentacles particularly attractive as food. Sally Lightfoot crabs have spoon-shaped tips to their claws. Their usual diet is algae scraped from the rocks. The claws are not so useful for penetrating the tough outer layer of the float animal. As the sargassum clumps approach the shore, most of their passengers abandon ship. Perhaps they're shaken off by the turbulence of waves in shallow water. It's rare to find crabs or anglerfish or sea slugs on the stranded clumps. Like sargassum's passengers, the clownfish leaves the man-o'-war before it's finally washed up. It's strange to think that the ghost crab lives largely on the results of accidents at sea. A lot of its food comes from an environment which would be completely alien to the crab itself. There's nothing left for the drifters now except to become part of some other creature's life. Any hard parts of the stranded animals will be dried by the sun and polished by the wind to become briefly an ornament to the beach before they become part of the sand. The float animals will writhe a little longer until they become too desiccated to bend. The rest of the crew are already dead. The extraordinary productivity of the surface layer of the sea depends on keeping the contributions of mankind to a minimum. So long as the sea remains clean, it will continue to provide coastal animals, including us, with food. It will also continue to be a source of wonder to land-bound human beings. Now we know what those delicately sculpted eggs on Bermuda's beaches are. They're the bleached skeletons of membranipara, which once grew round the bladders of Sargassum. They come from the oldest habitat in the world, and the first to be mentioned in the Bible's account of how things began, the face of the deep.